The room had been a careful geometry of light and linen, a constellation of polished faces under a chandelier that made every ambition look gilded. Lucas Marshall stood where he had always stood in such rooms, slightly apart, predatory charm, dressed as casual ease, the city glittering behind him through a wall of plate glass. He liked how the skyline made him feel larger, an island of control framed by steel and light. Jack found him there, laughing with a senator's donor and clearing space for a private triumph. "You'd do it for the right price," Jack said, half teasing, half cataloging. He watched Lucas with the amused cruelty of someone who enjoyed pushing pieces across a board. Lucas tilted his head. He read risk like a map. "Depends on the price," he said. Jack smiled and laid the bet out like a contract. Marry a woman outside his type, someone who offended his vanity, resisted his charm, for 6 months. Sealed with money enough to change the story of a restless patron, staged for the amusement of men who liked wagers more than they liked names. Jack's voice kept cadence with the clink of ice in a glass. It was, to everyone else at the table, social mischief. To Lucas, it was a calculation wrapped in spectacle. He agreed because his life was built to make agreements and win them. He agreed because the thought of bending the room, of turning disdain into triumph for sport, was a small, sharp satisfaction. He agreed and shook Jack's hand under the chandelier, not seeing the way someone at the edge of the crowd lifted their chin and watched as if they had long expected the move. Chloe Richards arrived at the party later, not announced, but arriving, the way people whose presence carried consequences tended to do. She wore a coat with a collar that defied the light, hair pinned back with an economy that suggested neither vanity nor affectation. When she stepped into the room, the city behind her still spoke in glass. She seemed indifferent to the skyline, interested only in people's faces. Her confidence was quiet and not theatrical. It was, Lucas would later think, the sort of confidence that made him feel briefly exposed, as if some of his practiced armor had a seam. She was not his type. Jack's laugh found her immediately, offering the wager as if it were a public puzzle. Lucas, delighted by the opportunity, could not foresee how quickly the wager would turn his world. Before the night was over, Lucas had performed what the wager required. Courtship staged in private messages and invitations, a small, conspicuous engagement announced over champagne and camera flashes. The marriage was arranged with the same efficiency he applied to mergers, lawyers, stipulations, a 6-month term that read like a clause in a contract. He loved clauses. They made feelings manageable. Chloe had accepted because accepting was part of a plan. She had stepped into Lucas's orbit with a steadiness that belonged to someone who had rehearsed stability against chaos. In the months that followed, their wedding became an act that split 2 kinds of audiences, those who believed in the glamour and those who watched for fractures. A few weeks after the wedding, in the penthouse that had once felt like an extension of Lucas's will, Chloe stood at the plate glass window and looked at the city. The skyline had that same indifferent shine. It made everything small and specular. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe in the way people in rich rooms forget the rest of the world. Air filtered and faintly scented with citrus, the distant hum of traffic like a man-made ocean. She had a photograph in her hand. The corner was soft from being carried, her father's smile from another life, a man whose shoulders once bore market day burdens and bookkeeper's corrections. She had not told Lucas about the photograph. She had not told him that her father had lost everything in a series of decisions tied, in part, to a company that Lucas's firm had absorbed and overseen. She had not told him that the pressure of that ruin had taken him to a place with no return. She had not told him about the pregnancy she had lost during those months when the house emptied and their bank accounts closed, a loss she had carried like a borrowed ache. Chloe folded the photograph and put it back in her pocket, the gesture of someone who kept facts in a private ledger. She had accepted the bet because it offered a way to put a man who had never accounted for the damage he caused in a position where accountability might, quietly, be extracted. Her plan did not begin as cruelty. It began as a desire for an equilibrium she thought only she could deliver, a moral arithmetic the system would ignore. She would balance the books between a man and the consequences his ambitions had washed over. The first months were a study in small resistances. Chloe attended the parties but left early. She learned the rhythms of Lucas's control and then refused to dance to them. She answered his texts with delay and brevity. She accepted his public gestures with a courtesy that cut like paper. Perfect manners, no warmth. Where he handed charm like currency, she gave him silence. Where he reached for ease, she planted firm, unyielding questions. Lucas noticed, vaguely at first, then with an unease he could not finesse away. His instinct was to regain the easy dominance he was used to. An inventory of his charms and concessions he reserved for those who mattered. But Chloe's indifference did not submit to charm. It became, for him, a mirror he could not ignore. Inside the penthouse, the motifs of his life took on new weight. The glass walls that had once made him feel like a man above consequence now pressed him with a kind of view that felt like accusation. He moved through rooms that glinted with money and found themselves echoing with silence. The same silence Chloe wielded. The first months were a study in small resistances. Chloe attended the parties but left early. She learned the rhythms of Lucas's control and then refused to dance to them. She answered his texts with delay and brevity. She accepted his public gestures with a courtesy that cut like paper. Perfect manners, no warmth. Where he handed charm like currency, she gave him silence. Where he reached for ease, she planted firm, unyielding questions. Lucas noticed, vaguely at first, then with an unease he could not finesse away. His instinct was to regain the easy dominance he was used to. An inventory of his charms and concessions he reserved for those who mattered. But Chloe's indifference did not submit to charm. It became for him a mirror he could not ignore. Inside the penthouse, the motifs of his life took on new weight. The glass walls that had once made him feel like a man above consequence now pressed him with a kind of view that felt like accusation. He moved through rooms that glinted with money and found themselves echoing with silence. The same silence Chloe wielded. The peonies he requested for the dining room arrived in arrangements full and fragrant. She placed them on the table and left them to wilt without comment. It was a small wound, the way gentleness ignored turned thorn. But those peonies mattered to him because he had once believed attention could fix everything. They did not fix her. They only marked his failure at making intimacy transactional. Jack took photographs that summer of Lucas looking slightly unsettled, and he circulated them with a companionable cruelty. The bet became gossip. Boardroom lunches shifted in tone as colleagues detected a man whose domestic life was no longer a projection of his power. Rumors were like small, efficient termites. They hollowed the place where he expected solidity. He could punish a competitor with strategy and then resume his seat. He had not yet learned how to punish himself when what he prized most, control, slipped through the cracks. Chloe's punishment was not spectacular. She did not smash his car or sabotage his accounts. She undermined the thing he used as a scaffold for being Lucas Marshall, the certainty of being desired and obeyed. She asked him questions in bed that had nothing to do with his feelings for her and everything to do with the ledger. The firm's acquisitions, the way his company had treated smaller vendors, a partner's lecture about ethics that his office had politely ignored. When he brushed off those questions with jokes, she began to leave him alone with his watchful reflection more often. When he tried to stage declarations of love, she answered with an absence that resounded. It made him suspicious. His suspicion took the shape of investigation, because that was the way he had always corrected a problem. Gather facts, then dominate the variables. He hired a private investigator.
Not because he was jealous of her past, but because the idea that she could withhold motives from him was intolerable. The investigator found small things: a name in a courthouse filing, whispered accounts in a small town, an obituary, a paused life stitched with loss. Lucas read the reports with a kind of menace that had never been trained on his own decisions. When the truth came to him in the form of a dossier and a recorded call, he felt unmoored. The records showed the company his firm had absorbed had collapsed under new management, that certain debts had been shifted and magnified until the small company that had supplied schools and cafeterias could not survive. Chloe's father had been one of those men who took on lines of credit for a community and found himself trapped in a pit that widened with every interest spike. There were lawyers' letters and a final silence that had been noted by neighbors. The private investigator's last note, unedited and unkind, said, "She lost more than property."
Lucas sat alone in the kitchen of his penthouse, the city like a circuit board below, and for the first time in his life he felt an absence of a precise solution. He had always known how to fix numbers that did not serve him. He had never been confronted by a ledger that needed a human apology instead of a strategic amendment. Chloe's revelation had been staged in private, as she intended. She did not confront him in public with the ruin. She held back the exposure like a card she planned to lay down when it would hurt the most. The night she told him, she sat opposite him at the small kitchen table and placed both palms flat on the wood. The light through the glass pooled like a long, indifferent sea. She said each fact with the control of someone recounting a chronology: the acquisition, the way invoices had been delayed, the tightening creditors, the hush that falls over a household when phones stop ringing. "You made that board decision," she said. She did not say it with accusation. She said it with a simple clarity that was worse. You were part of that machine. Lucas tried to answer with corporate phrases at first, terms meant to distance human cost from corporate strategy. She stopped him with one look that had no tenderness and no malice, only the steady, exact grief of a ledger being read aloud. "You made choices," she said. "My father signed debt he believed he could meet. He couldn't. He died." She did not describe how. Lucas recoiled from detail because detail would be spectacle. He attempted, as one skilled in persuasion, to name uncontrollable forces, markets, variables, unpredictability. Chloe listened, and then, with the small, deliberate cruelty of someone who had measured this moment for months, she told him also that she had been pregnant when the house began to fall. She had carried hope and then watched it end in private. A silence like winter settled between them. Lucas felt as if someone had taken a scalpel to the parts of him that had worked without thought. The room narrowed. His first impulse was to deflect, to find a legal loophole or a shareholder to blame. But under the words came a different sensation: the raw knowledge that his choices had reverberated beyond spreadsheets. He had not imagined the human geometry of his decisions. After she left that night, leaving the photograph of her father on the nightstand where he could see it, Lucas went to the glass and pressed his forehead to cool metal. The skyline reflected him. A man framed by lights he had once thought meant permanence. He had believed, stubbornly, that power insulated a man from consequence. He had been wrong. Chloe's revenge had not been a single act, but a method, a long withdrawal of warmth, a persistent exposure of negligence. It was intended to make him feel small, embarrassed, vulnerable in his own home. It had worked in ways she had expected and in ways she had not. When Lucas's empire began to judder, when a small vendor threatened litigation and news of a callous acquisition filtered into a paper that loved scandal, Chloe watched from the periphery with a conscience that was not entirely steel. She had wanted him to suffer, yes, but she had also wanted the world to recognize that there were faces beyond balance sheets. What terrifies a person like Chloe, what she had not anticipated when she accepted that wager, is how easily the heart makes room for contradictions. One night, months after the wedding that had been a show, she found herself at a church she had not visited in years.
fingers closed around parchment, voice low. She did not confess in the tidy sense. She prayed with the kind of small, private words people use when they are testing their own edges. She prayed for him. The prayer was not triumph, nor was it flattery. It was a plea, a raw, stubborn, surprising request for something she had not imagined she could ask for, that he would change in a way that acknowledged what had been done. She asked that he stop being what had raised her family's life. She asked, finally, for him to be accountable. And at the edge of that strange admission, she realized with a sensation like vertigo that wanting his conscience awakened also meant wanting him to be less of an enemy. Afterwards, she was frightened by the tenderness that had begun to uncoil in her like a plant too willing to the sun. The plan had been retribution, not rehabilitation. Yet a prayer, whispered and private, had opened something in her that threatened the structure she had built to keep herself safe. That terror was not supernatural. It was practical. Forgiveness untethered could leave her exposed again. She had designed the bet to control exposure. Prayer had unboxed possibility. Lucas, meanwhile, found his life contracting into places he could not predict. The board called him into meetings where his charm was irrelevant. It was his decisions being examined now. Investors, hungry for a narrative, tested his resilience. He began to see, in faces he had never sought to empathize with, the human circumference of his choices. A woman stalking a shuttered cafeteria, a father who could not find work after the company closed, a child who had learned to be cautious of banks that swallowed livelihoods whole. His first acts of restitution were clumsy. He started with a check that landed on Chloe's side table like an insult. She returned it unopened. He issued statements about corporate responsibility that read like press release virtue. She keeps a folder of such statements in a drawer marked with an economy reserved for files you do not wish to touch. Later, when he began to visit the neighborhoods affected, he could not purchase absolution with speeches. What transformed him was not public contrition, but a series of private, deliberate choices. He visited, quietly and with no cameras, the small town where Chloe's father had run a business.
He sat in a diner where the coffee tasted as if it carried the memory of hard mornings and worried hands, and he listened. He encountered people who did not want money as spectacle, but needed structural change. Payment schedules honored, small vendors given terms that recognized their fragility, the company's procurement team rewritten to guard against the kind of aggressive acquisition that had crushed livelihoods. When he proposed a reparative program within his firm, something that moved beyond settlements and into policy, he was met by the familiar resistance of men who defined morality by margins. He learned to ask for less immediate applause and more institutional durability. He restructured contracts, set up a nonpartisan oversight panel, and employed a small team dedicated to ensuring that future deals left no suppliers extinguished by leverage. It was the kind of bureaucratic work that did not fit in a magazine spread, but it mattered to people whose lives depended on modest, steady income. Chloe observed all of this from a distance that was both watchful and guarded. She saw that his actions were not a campaign. When the cameras had found him in the neighborhoods, he stayed. He did not seek headlines. He sat in kitchens and apologized without parentheses, listened to grief without trying to fix it with pledges that vanished with the tide of news. He made amends that were messy, handwritten notes, promises kept in small ways, attendance at town meetings, money for back invoices paid without fanfare. Her guard began to thaw not because his wealth had been repurposed, but because his behavior shifted in a way that required effort, embarrassment, and patience. He showed up and did not perform. He felt ashamed and stayed. The thaw did not happen overnight. It happened in sequences. Lucas arriving at a battered community center with a stack of boxes and stepping back to let volunteers sort them. Lucas standing in a cramped municipal room while a woman who had sold him coffee for years recounted the practical damage they'd endured, and him listening and taking notes. Lucas, at times, apologizing with a sting that was real because he had stopped practicing the right words and was fumbling for something more honest. Chloe would watch from the edges and sometimes meet his gaze across the table.
When she did, there was a new thing there, not triumph, but an invitation to examine whether what he had done could be made right. She began, slowly, to test the sincerity of his changes in small ways. She let him join a meeting where representatives from affected families were present, allowed him to speak, and then to be corrected. She watched whether he could take those corrections without flinching. And then came a scene that felt, for both of them, like the narrowing of years into a single intolerable moment. A local journalist, one who had sniffed scandal for years and whose pieces could make or break public sentiment, published a piece that dug into the details of the acquisition that had ruined Chloe's family. It cited firms, dates, board minutes. It named Lucas in a ledger of decisions. The headline was a scalpel. Public reaction was swift. Investors, long tolerant of abstract risk, began to balk. Partners whispered about reputational liability. His name became a subject for social feeds that took moral outrage as entertainment. The firm's stock took a small, sharp dive. In an industry that rewarded certainty, Lucas felt the novelty of uncertainty as public humiliation. He had to stand in front of his own employees, people he had always imagined he had rescued by his decisions, and tell them he had been part of a failure. It felt raw and terrible. He did not try to shape the message like a brand manager. He spoke with the clumsy truth of a man who had once believed that being good at deals equaled being a decent human. Chloe watched the collapse and felt the relief of seeing a system recognize itself and the fear of watching a man finally feel what she had felt for years. She did not dance on his ruin. She watched the way he weathered it, the effort of staying honest without a shield of public relations. In those days, they did not speak much. The marriage remained a quiet arrangement, but the air between them had changed. The revelation scene, the climax of months she had orchestrated in the only way she could, came in a small room at a community legal clinic. Chloe had arranged for families affected by the acquisition to come together, not to humiliate, but to tell their stories. She had invited him with a precision that made him know, when he arrived, that this was not another meeting where he performed a role. The room smelled of old coffee and a varnished table, and the heat that comes from too many people holding grief. One of the families, children present, told their story. They spoke about late payments, about losing a contract, about bills rolled forward until a household could not stand under the pressure. A woman placed a photograph on the table and left it there. It was Chloe's father. There was no sensational reveal because she had already told him in the penthouse. This was not for him, but for the record and for those who had lived the consequences. Lucas listened, and then, with a voice that shook, he apologized. He did not try to explain away metrics or defenses. He acknowledged the structural failures of a system that privileged speed and profit over the dignity of people who served it. He offered specific reparations, funds, contracts rewritten, and a commitment to community oversight. He spoke about how he had come to learn that policy mattered more than platitudes.
Chloe watched him, not because she wanted to be vindicated, but because she wanted to see if the man she had set out to punish could keep the promises he made when it required patience rather than spectacle. After the meeting, she caught his eye in the doorway and saw that he was raw with the labor of change. She was not ready to forgive in a neat sentence. Forgiveness, for her, would be iterative and provisional. If there was to be a second marriage, it would be because love had been rebuilt on new foundations: equality, repair, and deliberate humility. During those months, Lucas's isolation deepened in private. The company survived on measures he put in place and the grudging trust of a board that had seen enough volatility to fear it. His friends, once plentiful, became fewer as he stopped fitting the social scripts he had once used to maintain his identity. He lost that easy admiration and was forced into a different experiment, becoming a person who sought to serve rather than to be served. Chloe, meanwhile, confronted her own internal contradictions. The prayer she had whispered on a night when she was also tempted by singular revenge had loosened something she did not want to admit to: a capacity for hope that did not require vengeance.
The terror she had felt at that prayer was not horror at compassion, but a fear of losing control, of being left unarmored. She had crafted silence as armor. Now she found herself giving small concessions, letting Lucas into conversations about restitution, refusing to watch him fail from a distance. They found one another again in ordinary places that did not glitter. A municipal meeting where a vendor needed help, a hospital corridor where a family adjusted to a new reality, a shabby florist where the peonies were fewer and less perfect but bought with care. The second wedding happened without the spectacle of the first. There were no cameras, no staged vows. It took place in a small registry office, then in a modest hall where families and the people who had become witnesses to their reparation work stood and watched. Chloe stood with a bouquet of peonies that had been chosen because he liked them and not because they were meant to prove anything. She looked at him across that modest table and saw a man who had been humbled by consequences and had worked to change. There was still residue between them, memories that would not evaporate. But they had built something pragmatic and tender. When they exchanged vows, the words were quieter and more human. He promised to continue the work he had begun, and she promised to keep her eyes open for signs that insistence on justice was not being co-opted by charity. Months later, they would discover a small new shape, a pregnancy, not planned, arriving in a way that felt like the slow repair of a cracked vase cleaned and mended. It did not erase the past, it did not absolve.
It represented, for both of them, the strange possibility of life amid the ruins of what had been broken. Chloe, who had once thought of herself as an instrument of retribution, bore the cautious joy of someone who had learned that mercy does not erase memory, but gives it a shape that can hold a future. Lucas watched her with a small terror that was not like the old one. This was a terror of responsibility, of finally understanding how to be present and steady. When he held her hand in the late hours and the city's glass reflected both of them as a single, imperfect silhouette, he learned the measure of accountability. That it is not a performance, but a daily, often mundane choice to remain honest and to repair in concrete ways. Their second wedding, when they had the courage to call it that, was not a spectacle, but a gathering of people whose lives had intersected in complicated ways. Those who had been harmed sat beside those who had harmed or observed the harm. They danced once, then leaned into one another with a tired, patient joy. The music was simple, and the peonies had been chosen with the knowledge that flowers were less a message than an offering of attention. In the end, the story did not deliver a tidy moral. Chloe's revenge had set consequences in motion. Lucas's repentance had become a labor of structural mend and personal humility. They found love again not as a reward, but as a consequence of sustained repair. The terror Chloe once felt at praying for her enemy had shifted into something else. A recognition that when you ask God, or the quieter version of conscience that lives in the chest of someone who has been wounded, to touch a person you hate, you invite change that might undo your hatred and dismantle the architecture of your revenge. He never stopped being accountable. He visited families, rewrote contracts, created community oversight that no CEO could easily dismantle. He accompanied Chloe to meetings where restitution meant more than a ledger entry. She did not forgive him with theatrical absolution. She forgave him where it was earned and withheld where it was not. Their marriage came to resemble a public experiment in humility and private tenderness. When they learned they were to become parents, they did not promise a flawless future. They promised instead to teach the child what they had been taught, that dignity matters more than profit, that apologies require action, that silence can be a shield but also a wound. In a small photograph taken weeks after their second wedding, without pretense, with a cityscape visible through an open window, Chloe held his hand and watched the street below. He kissed her forehead and, for once, did not offer the kind of words that might have been polished in a PR meeting. He said simply, "I will keep doing better." She smiled with a small, weary softness, and in that look, something like hope took hold. It was not blinding, it was not absolute. It was the careful kind of hope that follows a long apprenticeship in consequence and repair. Some nights he would wake and go to the glass alone, pressing his palm to the cold pane. The city reflected him back, no longer an island, but a place in which he belonged in a different way, one that required humility. He prayed sometimes, uncertainly, for the courage to continue. Chloe had once prayed for his change and had been terrified at what she invited. The results had been messy, relentless, human. And yet messy and human, they were real. The reparations did not erase the past, but they shifted its ledger. The love that grew between them was not an erasure of blame, but a construction built on being seen, being held accountable, and choosing again each day to act in a way that honored the people who had been harmed. If anyone asked whether she regretted that private prayer, the one that had terrified her by loosening something she had meant to keep rigid, Chloe would say she did not know. She might say, instead, that fear had been part of the price of creating a future that could hold others. She had wanted justice, and she had also wanted life. In the end, she had learned that those things were not always mutually exclusive, only that they required work and witness and the willingness to remain unsettled by compassion. Outside the penthouse window, the city kept its indifferent glitter. Inside, the peonies wilted and were replaced. Silence softened into conversation. Glass ceased to be a frame of dominance and became at times a place to stand and watch the weather together. Accountability had not been a single act, but a slow, patient architecture of choices. It made forgiveness possible without cheapening harm. It made love not the negation of pain, but the careful possibility of repair. If the story carried a lesson, it was a complicated one. That praying for an enemy could terrify you because it asked you to consider mercy where you had built walls. And that when the world obliges those prayers into change, the result is less a miracle and more a labor. Of shame transformed into restitution, of reparation chosen instead of spectacle, of a love that had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Stay with the rest of this story and subscribe if the arc moved you. Like and hit the bell to follow every step of hard-won repair and the conversations it forces us to have about power, responsibility, and mercy. If this narrative stirred something in you, leave a respectful comment on what accountability means in your life. You might change how someone else sees restitution. The baby arrived on a rain-slicked morning. Chloe's labor was long and quiet in a way that matched how their marriage had been rebuilt. Patient, uneven, full of small, exacting tasks. He stood at the foot of the bed and watched the midwife's hands, the way Chloe clenched and released, the small flares of pain between breaths. When they put the child to his chest for the first time, there was a tiny, urgent sound like a breath being found. He had imagined that moment 100 different ways. None of them accounted for how hollow and full it would make him feel at once. They named her Leela, for the purple of late summer sunsets Chloe liked to look at from the balcony of their modest apartment now. No penthouse, no ostentatious windowsill of conquerors, only a rented place with a crooked radiator and a neighbor who played clarinet at odd hours. They liked the way the name carried both softness and shape, a word that could hold sorrow and song. Parenthood, like the work of restitution, refused the tidy narrative arcs he'd studied in corporate ethics manuals. Nights were a series of small betrayals, missed feedings, accidental words of frustration, followed by repairs. A lullaby hummed while his hands shook, Chloe's quiet forgiveness handed back like a bandage. They agreed, early on, to speak plainly in the house. If an action harmed another, they would call it harm. If an apology meant more than a sentence, it would be matched to a concrete act. The rules were harder than they sounded. Sincerity, they discovered, is not the same as usefulness. At daytime, he continued to answer for his past, partly because public inquiry had not ceased, and partly because accountability in a system is never finished.
He had founded a trust, an independent body with community representation, legal oversight, a rotating board that included people who had been harmed by the company's decisions. Money moved through it to schools, clinics, to funds that supported people navigating long-term health consequences. He visited centers, sat in rooms where wounds had settled into the bones of people's lives. He did not stand to speak often, he mostly listened. When he did speak, he tried to speak truthfully. First, to own what the company had done. Second, to explain what he had been doing since then. Third, to ask what should be done now. There were those who accepted this and those who did not. A woman named Rosa, who had lost her brother after a contaminated batch had been quietly shipped years before, came to a town hall meeting with a photograph folded in her hands. She spoke with a voice that did not seek catharsis so much as reckoning. "You can make funds," she said. "You can change names on doors, but we are still left with empty chairs. You cannot give us back the hours that were stolen. You cannot make that right." He felt words rising, defensive, articulate, the old litany, but he watched Chloe in the crowd and remembered how they had promised their child a life that included truth. He sat back, swallowed. "You're right," he said, and he meant it in a way he had not meant things before. Saying it did not erase the loss, it simply witnessed it. After the meeting, Rosa refused to shake his hand.
Later, she agreed to meet in a community kitchen and slowly, over months, to join a committee that advised the trust. Change, he learned, required more than money and policy. It required the rare labor of being available where you had once been absent. It required consent, sometimes reluctant, on the part of those harmed. He could institute paid leave for people affected, create retraining programs, fund memorial projects. He could not, with good conscience, force gratitude. That was a humbling education. Not everyone responded with dignity. There were voices in the press that labeled his work as image rehabilitation and asked whether a man could purchase absolution. Old allies whispered that he had been naive to lose the fierce machinery of PR that had protected him. They wanted him to steel himself, claim injuries to his reputation, file countersuits, fight. Sometimes, in the long night watches, he went through the motions of rage, drafting legal defenses in his head, imagining how to shout back at every column that had called him a villain. In the morning, when Leela woke and needed him, the rage felt childish beside the tiny gravity of a child's palm curled into his finger. Chloe watched him navigate that tension and at times wondered whether she had been unfair to ask so much of Mercy. When they argued, which they did with more frequency than either liked, the arguments had a particular texture. They were not only about money or public gestures, but about how one bears shame, how one keeps others safe while refusing to be broken by guilt. "You can't be everyone's teacher," she once said, voice raw, "and you can't let them make you their symbol either. Be a man for our child. Be a man who learns when she asks why you are on the news." He tried to answer the child's questions as plainly as possible. At 3, Leela could already point at photographs and ask, "Who is that?" When she asked about the man in a newspaper frame whose face was half covered by a headline, Chloe and he sat on the floor and told her a story shaped for a small imagination. There were people who made mistakes that hurt others, there were people who tried to fix those mistakes, and sometimes fixing meant saying sorry, and sometimes it meant giving what you have, and sometimes it meant listening. He told the truth without spectacle. He also left room for mystery. There were things adults were still figuring out. One afternoon, a reporter from a weekly magazine came to the trust seeking an interview. He agreed, though not without terms. The conversation would happen in the trust's office, with a mediator present and with 2 community advisors in the room. The article, when it ran, was less interested in his contrition than in the mechanics of the trust, budgets, audit practices, who sat on the board. The writer described his efforts with a cool distance. He read it over with Chloe beside him. "It's not flattering," she said. "It's not supposed to be." A new crisis arrived not in headlines, but in the ledger.
A subsidiary, reorganized in the wake of the scandal, had been sold to a foreign concern the year before his resignation. That company, now under its new management, had quietly collected profits from markets they had previously neglected to monitor strictly. An investigative reporter uncovered irregularities tied to that period, and plaintiffs' attorneys saw an opening. Lawsuits arrived, some legitimate, some fishing expeditions. The trust's legal counsel advised settlement on several claims to avoid further trauma to victims. Others pushed for full trial, for public testimony that might formalize shame in a way some victims desired. He stayed out of the legal minutiae as much as possible, but could not avoid the human consequences. The plaintiffs were often the same people he had met in community rooms: a single mother still paying off medical debts, an older man whose job had been undermined by a localized closure. Their pain was not abstract. Some suits were clearly opportunistic, attempts to extract money, but some were real and righteous. Sitting in the counsel's office, he felt again the old complacency, the impulse to employ lawyers like battering rams. He resisted. He insisted on offering direct mediation to those harmed, on creating options that allowed them to choose the path that best addressed their loss. Not everyone in the trust agreed. Some board members wanted to preserve financial assets zealously to ensure long-term sustainability. Others argued that public trials risked re-traumatizing victims and that settlements could bring immediate relief. The debates were furious, late into the night, and sometimes ended with no consensus at all. The governance model he had set up, intentionally messy and inclusive, proved also to be slow and occasionally exasperating. He learned to navigate patience as if it were a muscle he had never exercised. There were moments that felt like grace. A clinic reopened with funding from the trust, its waiting room crowded with people who had once been ignored. A scholarship program helped a teenager from a community devastated by layoffs attend university. These were not trumpets of jubilation, but small lights. Patient, stubborn, the kind of change that accumulates like sediment. He began to understand that reparative work is a long temporal art, less like a sudden absolution and more like a slow remaking of soil. Chloe returned, after months, to work with an urban education nonprofit. It suited her, direct, visible, and limited enough to allow grief and doubt to be held. She taught workshops on ethics and power, often bringing her own story lightly into the room. How she had once prayed for a man to change, how that prayer became a series of hard choices. She was careful not to frame herself as savior. Instead, she presented modest tools. How to listen when someone says they are hurt. How to craft restitution agreements that respect autonomy. How to measure success beyond simple dollars. Her classes filled quickly. People came from other cities, and sometimes those who showed up were the very kinds of executives she had once feared. She confronted them with questions more than accusations, and with a posture that insisted on results. This, she believed, was a discipline for institutions, not only individuals. He watched her in those moments, how she could hold firmness without acid, how she could extend possibility without apologizing for monstrous harms, and felt a new kind of love form. Proud, grateful, and chastened by the knowledge that such courage exacted both pain and endurance. In quieter minutes they traded small confessions. "Sometimes," she said once, "I think about the prayer and whether I misread God. Maybe God doesn't answer by making someone entirely new. Maybe God answers by making us small enough to be present in other people's suffering." He thought of that often. The old language of sin and redemption, of sinner and redeemer, had fallen away into something more human, flawed people choosing corrective action in an imperfect world. He prayed occasionally, haltingly, for steadiness, not to be forgiven in spectacle, but to be kept honest. A test of that steadiness came when a former subordinate, a charismatic executive named Marco, announced a new venture that had, by rumor and by leaked documents, a structure suspiciously similar to the old one. Marco had been a locus of both admiration and alarm. During the scandal, he had resigned quietly and established a consultancy that offered corporate turnarounds. Now his new firm promised innovative supply chains and an emphasis on speed above all else. There were whispers that he had retained some of the old ways in order to move faster by circumventing safety protocols. Chloe read an exposé first and called him at once. "What do you think?" she asked. He could have reacted with fury. He could have assembled a coalition to publicly shame Marco into oblivion. Instead, he emailed Marco and requested a meeting. The request itself felt precarious. Many in the community would see it as fraternizing with old habits. But he remembered the hard lesson of the woman who said you cannot give back hours stolen, of Rosa who would not take the easy comfort of symbolic gestures. He wanted information. He wanted also to see if there was a way to steer this new enterprise onto a safer course. They met in a neutral diner with vinyl booths and strong coffee. Marco arrived with a tremor of youthful bravado, long faded into an older, greasier cynicism. He explained his model with practiced charisma. "We move at the speed markets demand," he said. "Bureaucracy kills innovation." "And who bears the costs of that speed?" the protagonist asked simply.
Marco bristled. "We have protocols." "Which ones?" the protagonist pressed. "Are they community-led? Are they transparent? Can an independent auditor verify them?" Marco made a face as if bothered by the questions. The protagonist watched him and wondered which continent of his former self lived in Marco now. The one who had once excited him with daring strategies, or the one who had tacitly accepted that corners could be cut if the profit looked certain. When Marco flinched from specifics, the protagonist felt the old dread, that place in his chest which had once rationalized harm. He felt, too, a fear that his outreach would become a theater of hypocrisy. He left the meeting unsettled. In the days that followed, a small coalition of civil society groups filed inquiries. Regulators asked questions. Marco, sensing pressure, launched a defensive campaign, asserting that his operations were above board and that the criticism was ideologically driven. The narrative was messy, nuanced enough to make simple condemnation impossible, ugly enough to make quiet approval unbearable. Chloe sat beside him on the night the first subpoena arrived at Marco's office. "This is a test," she said, "not just for him." He nodded. Tests had a way of clarifying. They also had a way of revealing how much work remained undone. At home, Leela began to speak in sentences that surprised him. One night, she crawled into his lap, tiny knees knocking, and asked, unprompted, "Daddy, did you ever hurt people?" The question struck him like a hand on his chest. He could have given a rehearsed answer. Instead, he bent to her, looked into eyes the color of clothes, and said, the words simple as a pledged promise, "Yes, I did, and I am trying to help make it right." She considered this, as if weighing a scale. "Are you a bad man?" she asked. He thought of all the meetings, the funds, the nights of prayer. He thought of Rosa's photograph, of the clinic's opening, of Marco's defensive pivot. The old binary dissolved between his desire to be defended and the truth of his harm. "Not everything about a person is one thing," he said. "People can be bad in some ways and good in others. What's important is what you do next." She nodded, small and profound. "Okay," she said, and patted his hand. Outside, rain began again, soft at first, then heavier, blurring the city's lights into a slow watercolor. He walked to the window, palms against the glass as he had done so often, and watched his reflection fold into the wet street. In the reflection, he saw a man who had been dismantled, and who was in the painful business of being reassembled, no longer by design teams or spin, but by the tack and seam work of accountability. The knock at the door came just as he was about to sit with Chloe and map out another week of visits. He opened to find an elderly pastor from a neighborhood church and a young woman with a legal badge and a folder too thick for casual conversation.
The pastor's eyes were kind but tired. The lawyer's jaw was set. "We heard you're holding listening sessions next week," the pastor said. "We wanted to bring a group from the neighborhood that's been organizing around the living wage issue. People want to talk face to face." The prototypist felt a caution rise.
Any meeting could be a stage. Any openness could be weaponized. He also felt the old, easier instinct to control the room, to script restitution like a project plan. He took a breath. "Bring them," he said. "We'll listen." The lawyer's voice was reserved. "We also have documents," she added. "There are still unresolved claims. Some of the people we represent want to move forward with litigation. They want to be heard now, publicly." He nodded slowly. The architecture of accountability had been designed to make room for both, community-led listening and legal avenues for those who sought them. But design meets human contingency, and contingency had its own terrible logic. He felt the weight of that tension. That night, after the visitors left, Chloe and he sat at the small kitchen table and made a list. Not a plan for spin or rescue, but a tally of things they would not do. They would not speak over people harmed. They would not hide documents. They would allow the legal process to proceed without interference, even as they tried to make alternative remedies available. They would continue to fund the trust, but accept that sometimes funds were insufficient to heal what words could not. In the quiet after Lila slept, he wrote an email to the trust's board asking for a special meeting, a full airing of the latest claims, a review of the trust's responses, and a proposal to expand the community advisory panel with members chosen by neighborhood groups rather than vetted by institutional partners. He did not want control. He wanted legitimacy. It was a risky move. Some trustees would see it as unnecessary concession. Others would see it as overdue humility. He hit send, and for a moment felt almost giddy with fear. Fear had been his old fuel. Now it was an instrument to be handled carefully. Fear could prompt action. It could also freeze a man into old patterns. He chose, clumsily and deliberately, to let fear guide him toward transparency rather than self-defense. When he returned to the living room, Chloe was on the couch with a stack of papers from her nonprofit's latest curriculum module. She looked up and offered him a tired smile. "You're doing it again," she said softly. "Doing what?" "Choosing the hard way," she answered. "You're choosing the way that keeps you uncomfortable." He rested his head back and let out a breath that sounded like both surrender and relief. "I keep thinking," he said, "that there's a point where it will be enough." Chloe set the papers aside and shook her head. "Maybe it doesn't end," she said. "Maybe it becomes a practice, like washing dishes or making the bed. You keep doing it. You teach Lila to do it. You make a life in which people check themselves." He thought about that. A life of small, steady disciplines, of making choices not to avoid shame, but to meet it with repair. It was less dramatic than the narratives he had once craved, and far more trying. Outside, the rain slowed. From the street below came the faint sound of someone playing a clarinet, imperfect, persistent, like an attempt at melody. He imagined Rosa at her table, possibly still suspicious, possibly folding a photograph into an envelope. He imagined Marco planning defenses, and the young lawyer sharpening arguments for her clients. He imagined Lila waking in the night, needing milk, and he pictured himself there, fingers fumbling, steady by the grace of small acts. A new email arrived. It was from a local coalition that had been tracking corporate harm for years. They thanked the trust for recent funding, but asked, bluntly, for a public accounting of all advisory meetings, minutes, and communications with former executives. They wanted names attached to decisions. They wanted transparency that was not curated. He read it twice. The request was reasonable and piercing. He forwarded it to the trust's counsel with a short note, "Release everything." Then he picked up the phone and called the pastor who had visited earlier. "Can you bring 3 people to the next meeting who do not serve on any board and who have no institutional ties?" he asked. "People who have lived through this." "Yes," the pastor said without hesitation, "we will bring them." The city, outside his window, kept turning. It had a way of sustaining itself through neglect and kindness alike.
He pressed his palm to the glass and watched the lights bloom and fade. In the apartment, Chloe slept with Lila's small feet tucked under her chin. There was no tidy redemption to sleep toward, nor a single moment of absolution to be demanded. There were only the nights and the days, the small chosen acts, the painful conversations, and the public ones that would not let them rest. He stood there a long time, thinking of the list they had made, things they would not do, and then of the even longer list they had yet to create, promises to keep, conversations to open, structures to humble. The work continued, not as a spectacle, but as a persistent, ordinary making of something steadier than a press release. In the morning, they would go to the community kitchen. In the afternoon, there would be meetings and documents and perhaps a lawyer's request to delay a hearing. They would do what they could, imperfectly, with witnesses present, and learn to accept that accountability is less a destination than a way of traveling. He felt the pull of that truth like a compass. When Lila woke, she found him at the window again. She toddled over, climbed into his lap, and pointed at the street. "Who's that?" she asked, noticing an old woman balancing a grocery bag. "Someone on the street," he said.
Can we help her? Lila asked, as if help were always a simple verb. He looked at Chloe, and they both rose. Small hands in his and hers, they went down the stairs together. The city met them with its usual mixture of indifference and possibility. At the corner, the old woman smiled when they offered to carry her bag. She thanked them with a voice made of years. Lila grinned as if the world had been reshaped by a single polite gesture. They walked on, not certain of anything but the necessity of continuing, step by step, to answer for what had been done and to teach their child how to do the same.